Nobody expected a dry slice of bread and a plastic cup of water to spark national outrage. But when Jonah Ellison, a 42-year-old tech executive, was humiliated in first class, what followed wasn't just a viral video. It was a reckoning. In less than 48 hours, the airline industry faced what no lawsuit ever forced: public accountability, federal scrutiny, and a cultural shift led by one man who refused to be invisible any longer. It didn't begin with violence. It didn't begin with shouting. It began with silence. A silence wrapped around a thin slice of dry bread and a clear plastic cup of water. And the silence only broke when a flight attendant smirked and said, "This meal fits you." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. On a quiet morning flight from San Diego to New York, Jonah Ellison boarded first class, wearing a navy hoodie, comfortable jeans, and sneakers. 42 years old, CEO of a logistics automation firm valued at just over $2 billion. But none of that mattered when the cabin crew first saw him. Not the merger waiting on the other coast, not the technology his company had just sold to a major airline. What they saw instead was a black man who didn't look the part. What followed would ricochet through corporate boardrooms, government offices, and millions of screens across the internet. But to understand how this moment became a movement, you have to step back, not into the headlines, but into the silence, into the assumptions no one says aloud, into the reasons why a man like Jonah could be seated in 1A and still be treated like he didn't belong. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a system at work. Psychologists call it implicit bias, those snap judgments our brains make without conscious awareness. For the flight attendant, who would later claim she didn't know who he was, it may not have felt like discrimination. But the brain doesn't need intent to cause harm. Studies show that black passengers are more likely to be mistaken for service workers or security threats. Even in elite spaces, it happens at restaurants, luxury hotels, even executive conferences, and yes, on flights too. In Jonah's case, bias didn't arrive all at once. It crept in. The coldness at the check-in counter, the tight smiles that didn't reach the eyes, the silence when other passengers were greeted by name, offered drinks, asked if they needed a pillow, but he was passed by, over and over. By the time the dry bread landed on his tray table, it wasn't a surprise. It was just confirmation. And that's what makes stories like this so powerful and so dangerous, because they are not accidents. They are patterns. The airline's internal records, as Jonah would later uncover, held multiple complaints filed against the lead flight attendant, all dismissed, all labeled as inconclusive. That's not coincidence. That's a workplace culture shaped by moral disengagement, a psychological term for how people distance themselves from the consequences of their actions. It lets someone say, "I didn't mean it," and move on. But intent doesn't erase impact. What struck Jonah most wasn't just the behavior of the crew. It was the silence of the bystanders, the well-dressed passengers who looked away, the co-attendant who said nothing, even as he heard it all. It's a phenomenon researchers call diffusion of responsibility, when everyone assumes someone else will step in, and so no one does. But one person did. A woman seated across the aisle. Her name was Megan Tran, Vietnamese-American, early 30s, a political journalist with The Atlantic. And while the crew ignored Jonah, Megan took notes, photographs, and eventually video. As the footage made its way online, something unusual happened. People didn't just watch, they shared, commented, told their own stories. A hashtag emerged, #, this meal fits. And in less than 24 hours, a slice of dry bread became a national headline. The story had all the elements that fuel viral fire: clear injustice, a calm and composed protagonist, a visible villain, and a twist no one saw coming. But more than that, it tapped into something universal: the hunger to feel seen, to feel respected, especially in places where respect is supposed to be a given, like first class. The moment was tailor-made for modern algorithms. There was visual contrast, the polished luxury cabin versus the insult of the meal. There was a turning point, the moment Jonah quietly pulled out his phone and documented it all. And there was catharsis, when the crew finally realized who he was and who he worked for. Jonah wasn't just a passenger. He was about to become their employer. Still beneath the thrill of comeuppance, a deeper question remained. Would any of this have happened if Jonah hadn't been rich? If he hadn't had access to media, legal teams, and leverage in the form of a pending acquisition? That's the discomfort that lingers. Because for every Jonah, there are thousands of passengers whose stories never go viral, who don't have proof, who don't know who to call, and who sit quietly, swallowing the dry bread of someone else's assumptions. The U.S. Department of Transportation recently introduced new rules requiring greater transparency and protections for air travelers. That's a start, but discrimination still shows up in quieter forms, in what's offered or not offered, in who is seen or ignored. And when complaints go nowhere, when records are wiped clean, silence becomes a second wound. Jonah didn't shout. He didn't curse. He didn't call for someone to be fired. He simply made sure the world was watching. Some revolutions begin with outrage. This one began with restraint, with a man who knew that justice doesn't always come from screaming. It can come from a calm voice, a clear plan, and the kind of silence that refuses to stay quiet. Because this wasn't about a meal. It was about a message. The day began the same way as so many others. Jonah Ellison, 42 years old, methodical and measured in everything he did, zipped up his travel bag as sunlight filtered through the bedroom window. His wife, Monica, leaned on the door frame with arms crossed, eyes flickering with quiet concern. She didn't have to ask where he was going. She already knew. New York. Another high-stakes meeting. Another week of suits, boardrooms, and digital war rooms. But this trip felt different. Jonah wasn't just heading to a merger. He was heading toward a final negotiation that would place him at the helm of a commercial airline his company had spent the last 9 months preparing to acquire. If all went according to plan, he wouldn't just be attending the board meeting, he'd be rewriting the rule book. Down the hall, the sound of feet pattering on hardwood interrupted the moment. Their 7-year-old son, Jordan, bounded into the room, still in his space-themed pajamas. "Can I come with you this time?" he asked, eyes wide. Jonah crouched and pulled his son close. "Not this trip, little man, but next time, maybe." Jordan tilted his head, skeptical. "Promise?" Jonah hesitated only a moment. "Promise." Behind him, Monica offered a knowing smile. They both knew what next time really meant. Jonah was changing industries, and maybe with it, the rules of how people like him moved through the world. 10 minutes later, a black town car rolled up outside their mid-century home in the Silver Lake Hills. The driver greeted him by name, placing his suitcase gently in the trunk. Jonah slid into the back seat and let the quiet hum of the engine settle his thoughts. But as the car pulled away, a familiar tension crept in, the kind that always arrived before boarding a flight. Jonah had flown first class hundreds of times. He'd logged more miles than he could count. But no matter how many private lounges or platinum memberships he acquired, there was always a moment. That moment, the glance, the pause, the double check. It would come, he knew. It always did. At LAX, the driver pulled into the dedicated first-class drop-off lane. The morning rush buzzed with travelers. Rolling suitcases clattered against the sidewalk. A family of four struggled to stack their luggage cart. Airport attendants barked directions over handheld radios. Jonah emerged from the car in a soft charcoal hoodie, crisp black joggers, and high-end sneakers. His travel uniform, comfortable, understated, efficient. He adjusted his glasses and pulled the handle of his suitcase, heading toward the first-class check-in zone. At the counter, a young woman in a red uniform tapped quickly at her keyboard. She looked up and immediately gave a tight, polite smile, the kind that doesn't touch the eyes. "Coach check-in is over there," she said, nodding toward a longer line around the corner. Jonah placed his ID and airline loyalty card on the counter, his tone calm. "I'm in 1A. The agent glanced down. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She checked the screen, then checked again. A flicker of something crossed her face. Recognition, not of Jonah, but of her mistake. "Ah," she said quickly. "Of course. Welcome aboard, Mr. Ellison." No apology, just a shift in posture, and the quiet recalibration that comes when assumptions are proven wrong. Jonah gave a tight nod, taking back his documents. "Thank you." As he made his way towards security, the incident played on loop in his mind, not because it was shocking, but because it was expected. The interaction wasn't about rudeness. It was about placement. Her initial response had been automatic, unconscious. She hadn't even considered that he belonged in that space. Psychologists have a name for that. Implicit bias. It operates under the surface, influencing behavior in ways that feel normal to the person acting. And airports, especially the stratified world of commercial aviation, are some of the most fertile ground for it. The TSA checkpoint moved slowly. Jonah waited behind an older man struggling to lift a large suitcase onto the conveyor belt. Without a second thought, Jonah stepped forward. "Let me help you with that," he offered. The man gave him a surprised smile. "Thank you, son. You work here?" Jonah hesitated. "Number just flying today." "First class?" The man's surprise deepened. Jonah nodded, smiling politely. 1A. It wasn't meant to offend, but it landed the same way every time. The assumption wasn't malicious. It was cultural, generational, familiar. When Jonah finally reached the scanner, the TSA agent asked him to step aside for an additional screening. Random, they said. A spot check. Happens all the time. But Jonah knew better. After clearing security, he walked past a luxury goods store where a white passenger in a tailored suit was being offered a complimentary drink. The same store clerk made no move toward Jonah as he passed. At the airline's elite lounge entrance, 2 attendants were welcoming passengers by name. Jonah approached, passport and ticket ready. One of them smiled and said, "Are you here for baggage delivery?" Jonah paused. "Number I'm flying first class." "Oh," she said, a beat too late. Inside the lounge was hushed. Soft music played beneath the clink of glassware. Jonah took a seat in a quiet corner, opened his tablet, and began reviewing notes. The final pitch deck for the merger was already loaded, annotated, and rehearsed. He would be presenting to the airline's full board at 9 a.m. sharp. The final step in an acquisition that had taken nearly a year to orchestrate. As he worked, he watched other passengers interact with the staff, being escorted to massage chairs, offered hors d'oeuvres, checked on repeatedly. No one approached Jonah. It wasn't just oversight. It was pattern recognition. First-class service is supposed to be proactive, personalized, responsive, but only for those who fit. In recent months, the federal government had made moves to increase transparency in air travel. New rules required airlines to disclose fees and issue automatic refunds for major delays. Consumer advocates celebrated it as a win for fairness. But there was no law mandating equity in human interaction, no rule requiring someone to check their biases before offering champagne. Jonah's assistant, Nina, texted him an update. Legal docs uploaded, confirming 9 a.m. boardroom schedule, monitoring flight UA116 from control. Jonah replied with a thumbs-up emoji. Short, simple, efficient. Boarding began minutes later. As he approached the gate, another agent gave him a long look, a glance at his shoes, his hoodie, his luggage. "Sir, business class is boarding next," she said carefully. "I'm in 1A, Jonah replied, calm, even. She blinked, then scanned his boarding pass. "Right this way." On the jet bridge, another passenger muttered under his breath, "Guess they're letting tech bros buy their way in now." Jonah didn't flinch. He'd heard worse. Being mistaken for a rapper, a bodyguard, an intern. But that wasn't the point. The point was this. Every time, it chipped away. A recent report from the Department of Transportation noted that formal discrimination complaints against airlines remain relatively rare. Just 16 filed in a single month. But experts believe the real number is far higher. Most passengers never file. Most incidents are too small to prove. And those who try are often dismissed as overreacting. That's why Jonah never argued. He documented, quietly, methodically. As he entered the cabin, he glanced at his seat, one already spotless and gleaming. But what mattered now wasn't the leather upholstery or the leg room. It was the fact that the moment he sat down, he'd be making a choice to remain invisible or to watch, record, and prepare. Because while everyone else thought this was just another business trip, Jonah knew better. This wasn't about luxury. This was a test, and everyone around him had already started failing it. The cabin lights glowed soft and amber as Jonah stepped into first class. For a moment, the hum of the plane was all he heard, the low whir of air circulation, the shuffling of feet behind him, the quiet zip of jackets being removed and folded. He found his seat, 1A, window side. Premium leather, pillow already in place. Jonah placed his bag in the overhead bin, sat down slowly, and pulled out his tablet. His fingers moved with purpose, reviewing slides for tomorrow's board meeting. But his attention was split. He was already taking mental notes. The first indication of what was to come appeared just minutes later. A flight attendant, auburn hair pinned back neatly, glanced toward his row. Her name tag read Celeste. Her eyes landed on Jonah for less than a second before veering away. She walked straight past him to greet the couple in 1C and 1D. "Welcome aboard," she said brightly. "Champagne or orange juice?" Jonah heard the clink of glasses being passed across aisles. Warm laughter, genuine hospitality, and still no greeting at 1A. He waited. 10 seconds. 20. long enough to give her the benefit of the doubt. Celeste passed again, this time with a tray of warm towels. She offered one to the man across the aisle, then to the woman beside him, and again skipped Jonah's row entirely. It was deliberate. That's when Jonah began recording. Not with a camera, not yet, but with timestamps, observations, behavior, because this wasn't new, it was patterned. Discrimination in elite travel spaces often begins not with direct insults, but with exclusion, a skipped greeting, a delayed drink, an unanswered request. A researcher might call it selective disengagement, a form of bias where the person exhibiting it still believes they're being professional, still believes they're treating everyone equally, even as they consistently overlook certain individuals. Jonah had seen this before, on flights, at luxury hotels, in boardrooms where he was assumed to be someone's assistant, and always when he wore what made him comfortable. To them, a black man in a hoodie didn't scream executive. It triggered something else, something unspoken. The subtle avoidance continued. Celeste poured wine for other passengers. She fetched blankets. She took dinner orders row by row. She never made eye contact with Jonah. As the final passengers boarded, a woman in her late 30s took the seat across the aisle, 1B, blonde ponytail, oversized tote. She settled in, tapping something on her phone, then glanced briefly at Jonah. Their eyes met. She gave him a polite nod. Celeste returned moments later, suddenly all warmth and welcome. "Good evening. May I get you a glass of champagne?" The woman, whose boarding pass read Margot Jensen, smiled. "Yes, please." Jonah looked down. Still no drink. When Celeste returned, she didn't look at him. Instead, she whispered something to another flight attendant, taller, blonde, maybe in his early 40s, whose name tag read Rob. Jonah heard it clearly. "I think he's in the wrong cabin." Rob didn't react visibly, just gave a brief glance toward 1A, then continued down the aisle with his cart. Jonah said nothing, just noted the time. 6:42 p.m., still no greeting, no drink, no towel. He tapped open a secure app on his tablet, Skytrace, developed by his own firm. It silently synced with the plane's internal surveillance network and stored encrypted visual and audio logs in the cloud, available only to senior compliance officers during quality audits. On this flight, it was already recording. Across the aisle, Margot shifted in her seat, watching the exchange. She seemed to notice the silence around Jonah, the absence of service, her brow furrowed slightly. Jonah didn't need her to say anything. The shift in her posture said enough. Minutes later, Celeste returned, finally stopping at 1A. But this time, her hands were empty. She didn't offer a towel or a menu. Instead, she held a small tray with a dry slice of bread and a plastic cup of water. No plate, no linen, no options. "Here you go," she said. "This meal fits you." There it was. No ambiguity, no misunderstanding. Jonah stared at the tray. Margot visibly stiffened in her seat, lips parted in disbelief. The older man in 1C, who'd been nodding off, opened one eye, registered the comment, and quickly looked away. Jonah didn't respond. He reached for his phone, quietly, without fanfare. He snapped a photo of the meal, then adjusted the angle to include Celeste's name tag. He opened a secure message thread and typed one line: "Begin full documentation. Flight 287. He hit send. Across the aisle, Margot leaned forward slightly. "Excuse me," she said. Celeste turned. "Yes? Why didn't he get the same menu I did?" Margot asked, nodding toward Jonah. Celeste smiled, tight and cold. Some passengers don't care for fine dining. The lie landed like a slap. Margot's jaw clenched. I think he can speak for himself. Celeste blinked. Her smile faltered. Would you like something else, sir? She asked Jonah, finally addressing him. Jonah looked up slowly. His voice was even, controlled. Is this the standard first-class meal? We're limited today, Celeste said, out of most entrees. That's interesting, Margot said. You just offered me beef or salmon. I ordered the beef. Jonah reached into his bag, pulled out his ID badge, digital, with a company seal embossed in gold. He held it just long enough for Celeste to see. Her face drained of color. Without another word, she turned and walked briskly to the galley. Jonah checked his phone. A new message blinked on screen. Security team notified. Recording initiated. PR on standby. He slid the device into airplane mode, tucked it away. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't demanded anything. He didn't need to. Power didn't always come from volume. Sometimes it came from silence backed by precision. For the next 10 minutes, no one approached him. Celeste avoided his row entirely. Rob continued serving wine to others, but skipped 1A. When she returned, Celeste offered Margot a filet mignon on fine china, accompanied by roasted asparagus and a glass of red wine. Margot pushed it aside. He should be served first, she said, nodding toward Jonah. Celeste's lips parted, but no sound came. I insist, Margot added. With trembling hands, Celeste set the plate on Jonah's tray table. He looked at it, then back at her. I'm not hungry, he said quietly. A ripple of silence passed through the cabin. A voice crackled over the intercom, the captain welcoming passengers, announcing their cruising altitude, estimated arrival, and weather in New York. But the atmosphere in the cabin had changed. Across several rows, passengers now watched the interaction from the corners of their eyes. Not all with sympathy, some with confusion, others with discomfort. Jonah could feel it, the shift, not because he wanted attention, but because it confirmed what he already knew. Racism in elite spaces doesn't always look like slurs. It looks like isolation, like pretending someone doesn't exist. Celeste had failed to do that. Now every word was recorded, every omission documented. Jonah's phone buzzed with a silent notification. One of his analysts had pulled the personnel files for the crew. Celeste, Reynolds. 3 prior complaints for discriminatory service, each labeled unsubstantiated. Rob Monroe. No complaints filed, but no commendations either. Quiet complicity. The captain, Cameron Bell, had once faced allegations of misconduct during a flight 5 years ago. A passenger had accused him of using racial slurs during a confrontation. The airline's HR department had closed the case with no disciplinary action. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a pattern. Later in the flight, Celeste passed by again, this time with a silver tray holding champagne and dessert. She offered both to Margot, then paused at Jonah's seat. Would you care for something now? No, Jonah said, still not hungry. Her smile collapsed. She moved on. Margot leaned over again. I've seen some terrible things, but that was next level. Jonah offered a faint nod. That's why it's being documented. Good, she said. Let it burn. By hour 2, another passenger, an older man seated further back, whispered something Jonah couldn't quite hear. But the words, "At diversity higher," and "lucky to be here," drifted just close enough to register. This time, Jonah didn't respond. He didn't need to. The flight was being monitored. Every comment, every transaction, The crew's internal comms were syncing in real time to a secure backup. Jonah wasn't just preparing a lawsuit. He was building a case study. A few rows back, Rob handed a scotch to a different passenger and whispered, "I told her not to mess with him." The man chuckled. Too late now. Jonah's screen lit up with a final message before descent. Video extracted. #, this meal fits, is trending. 50,000 shares in 3 hours. The public had noticed. The movement had begun. And Jonah, he just looked out the window. Below, the lights of Manhattan flickered into view. Above, the plane flew steady, silent, unaware that it had become ground zero for a cultural reckoning. At 35,000 feet, time behaves differently. Minutes stretch, seconds tighten, every gesture becomes amplified, every silence exaggerated. And inside the first-class cabin of Flight 287, a reckoning was quietly unfolding. Jonah Ellison sat back in his seat, the untouched meal tray in front of him like a monument. One slice of bread, one cup of water, one calculated insult. But Jonah wasn't waiting for an apology. He was executing a plan. Across the aisle, Margot Jensen glanced toward him, brows furrowed. "You're building something," she whispered. Jonah gave a slight nod. Documentation first, conversation later. From his tablet, he tapped into a custom app his company had developed for internal operations, Verity Vault. Normally used to monitor logistics efficiency, it was now streaming metadata from the flight's security network. Not the public feed passengers knew about, but the hidden one, meant for auditing service quality and onboard behavior during high-stakes routes. This wasn't just any merger, and this wasn't just any airline. Jonah's firm had been quietly building a next-generation aviation intelligence system, now being piloted on select flights, including this one. His assistant Nina's messages flowed in clean and tight. Voice logs from crew show escalating concern. Cabin conversations synced. #is viral. This meal fits hit 90,000 impressions in 40 minutes. Jonah read the update, then set the tablet down and looked around. The cabin hadn't shifted physically, but socially it had transformed. Passengers who had ignored him now cast glances of curiosity. The flight attendants who once passed by without a word had now moved more slowly when approaching his row, calculated, cautious. But that wasn't strategy. That was fear. Jonah wasn't interested in fear. He wanted accountability. He wanted structure change, not scapegoats. That's why when Celeste nervously returned with a menu and a forced smile, he simply said, "No thank you." Then he turned to Margot. "I need a witness." "You have one," she replied instantly. Mid-flight turbulence rumbled through the cabin, minor but noticeable. A soft chime followed as the seatbelt sign blinked back on. Passengers paused conversations. Crew members paused their movements. For a few seconds, silence returned. Then came the voice. "This is your captain speaking, folks. We're expecting a few bumps for the next 10 minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll resume service shortly." Jonah froze for a fraction of a second. He knew that voice. Captain Chase Holland. He'd explicitly requested, that Holland not be assigned to this route. 4 months ago, during a confidential audit involving the same airline, Holland had been flagged in an internal report. Not for technical failure, but for patterned cultural misconduct, subtle infractions, derogatory comments overheard by flight staff. His record had been reviewed and quietly shelved. Now here he was. Jonah's jaw tightened slightly. This wasn't oversight. This was resistance. Someone inside the airline's chain of command had placed Holland on this flight, likely assuming that Jonah wouldn't notice. Or worse, hoping he would, and that it would rattle him. Jonah picked up his phone. Captain ID verified, requesting all previous comm logs. Confirm escalation protocol. Nina replied within seconds. Already pulled. Holland flagged in internal HR logs twice. Legal reviewing. Should we initiate cabin-level action? Jonah typed. Hold. Let them keep digging. Because that was the real power of restraint. Let the people who thought they were safe reveal themselves. Let them feel untouchable long enough to speak freely. And they had. From the synced voice logs, Jonah already had confirmation. Earlier in the flight, one of the crew had joked that Jonah had probably paid for his seat with a diversity grant. Another had made a crack about fried chicken and low expectations. It was all recorded. Across the cabin, Rob, the second attendant, finally approached with something resembling remorse. He leaned down and spoke low, voice just above the engine noise. Sir, I just want to say I didn't mean to offend. Jonah looked at him, calm and clear-eyed. You didn't say anything. I didn't stop anything either, Rob admitted. Jonah nodded once. Exactly. There it was. The core of the problem. Not the person who insults you. The people who watch it happen and stay quiet. The bystander effect, well documented in social psychology, takes on sharper edges in places of privilege. People don't want to interrupt comfort. They don't want to risk their access by standing up. So they convince themselves it's not their problem. Jonah leaned in slightly. Do better. That starts now. Rob nodded quickly and stepped back. Margot watched the exchange with sharp eyes. He's rattled. They all are, Jonah said. Do you think they'll try to apologize officially? They already are. He gestured slightly toward the front galley, where Celeste was now engaged in quiet, frantic conversation with a third attendant. New to the scene, likely from the coach cabin, pulled forward to stabilize the dynamic. But Jonah wasn't looking for symbolic gestures. He wanted action, accountability without PR spin, and behind the scenes, his team was building just that. Nina's next message, media interest initiated. 3 reporters flagged the hashtag. 2 influencers on the flight have posted. Public interest is building. Sit tight. Jonah cracked the faintest smile. He didn't need to post anything. Others already had. Moments like this, when captured and amplified, had real power. Not just as spectacle, but as leverage. Social media wasn't the justice system, but it could trigger justice. Just weeks ago, the Department of Transportation had finalized new rules, forcing airlines to be more transparent, requiring refunds, banning hidden fees, and enforcing passenger rights more aggressively. The public wanted reform. Jonah's incident was now riding that wave. But the work ahead was deeper, because the problem wasn't the bread and water, it was everything around it. The silence, the smirks, the systemic shielding of bad behavior, the HR files with insufficient evidence stamped 3 times over. Across the aisle, Margot sat up straighter. What happens when we land? Jonah turned toward her. They'll try to meet me at the gate, with a prepared statement, maybe a bottle of wine. Will you meet with them? He paused, only with cameras rolling. Margot nodded. I'll be there. She pulled out her phone and tapped open her recording app. Jonah noticed the logo on the screen. Atlantic Dispatch. Your press. he said quietly. "Freelance contributor. I didn't want to lead with it." "Smart." Jonah stared forward, letting the silence settle again. The tension in the cabin had shifted. Not gone, but waiting. The final hour of the flight passed with little disruption. No turbulence, no direct contact from Celeste or Rob. But eyes lingered. Conversations hushed. Even Holland's voice over the intercom, usually confident and casual, now carried an edge of performance. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into New York. Local time is 8:43 p.m., and the weather is clear. We'll be landing shortly." As the plane leveled out, Jonah refreshed his tablet. On screen, a dashboard of synced video clips, audio snippets, time logs, and facial recognition matches, all compiled into a clean dossier labeled Flight 287, Ellison Incident, Discrimination Escalation Report. He toggled to a second screen, Policy Solutions Draft. His team had already begun outlining reforms, mandatory equity audits, anonymous passenger complaint pathways, AI-monitored service logs, and FAA-backed reporting mandates tied to funding. It wasn't enough to fire Celeste, or reprimand Rob, or sideline Holland. Those were easy victories. What Jonah wanted was systemic redesign. As the wheels dropped into position and the seatbelt chime echoed through the cabin, Jonah adjusted his posture and fastened the belt. Across the aisle, Margot did the same. "Ready for round 2? She asked. Jonah nodded once. "Let's land this right." Outside the window, the lights of New York stretched toward the horizon, but inside the aircraft, the real descent wasn't physical. It was social, and the people who once felt untouchable, they were the ones bracing for impact now. The wheels struck the tarmac with a dull screech. The cabin jolted softly as the aircraft decelerated, engines reversing with a subdued roar. Outside, JFK's runway lights zipped past like electric stitches sewn across the dark. Inside seat 1A, Jonah Ellison sat still, composed, focused. He didn't rush to unbuckle his seatbelt. He didn't glance at his phone. The final act hadn't begun. Not yet. The seatbelt sign dinged off overhead. Passengers stirred, stretching limbs, opening overhead bins, but first class moved differently now. Tension pulsed in the air. Something unspoken had occurred, and everyone knew it. Jonah stood slowly, retrieving his carry-on from above. As he reached for the handle, he caught movement from the front galley. Celeste stood frozen by the curtain, her lips parted. A napkin clutched in her hand. She approached hesitantly. Her voice was nearly a whisper. "Mr. Ellison, please. I didn't know who you were." Jonah looked at her, eyes calm, voice lower still. "And that's exactly the problem." The words landed sharper than anything shouted could have. She tried to hand him the note, a last-ditch plea scribbled in ink. He didn't take it. "I've already received your message," he said. Her face fell, and she stepped back. From the cockpit, Captain Holland emerged. His cap was on, his shoulders squared, the same old posture of practiced command, but the fire in his eyes was dulled now, replaced with calculation. He stepped into the aisle, nodding toward Jonah with forced cordiality. "Mr. Ellison," he said, extending his hand, "let's speak privately, off the record." Jonah didn't move. "That's not going to happen." The captain held his posture for a beat, then dropped his hand and turned away. Passengers behind them watched in hushed curiosity. A few were already texting, others recording quietly. Margot stood beside Jonah, phone in hand, not hidden. The aircraft door opened with a pressurized hiss. But instead of the typical gate agent and bustling crowd, the exit was flanked by two individuals in black suits. earpieces glinting in the cabin light, airport security, plain clothes. Behind them stood a poised black woman in a fitted navy blazer. "Mr. Ellison," she said, voice firm, respectful. "Vanessa Hart, Director of Executive Security Operations." Jonah nodded. "Thanks for coming. This way, please." Jonah stepped onto the jet bridge. Margot followed, her press badge now visible. Behind them, Celeste remained rooted in place. Rob lingered near the galley, eyes avoiding contact. At the end of the bridge, a black SUV idled quietly. Near it, a second vehicle. A third carried a legal team. Vanessa opened the rear door. "The boardroom is ready." Inside the terminal, away from passengers and press, a secured conference wing had been reserved. Jonah entered a sleek, glass-walled room. Waiting for him was his assistant Nina, tablet in hand. Beside her sat two attorneys and a quiet man in a gray suit, head of Airline HR. The airline's CEO, Richard Bauer, stood as Jonah approached. "Jonah," Bauer began, voice tight, "this is all a terrible misunderstanding. I want you to know." Jonah raised a hand. "This is not a misunderstanding. This was a culture check, and your team failed it." He took his seat at the head of the table. Margot stood near the wall, phone recording, silently observing. Nina slid the tablet toward Jonah. "Ready?" He tapped it once. The wall-mounted screen lit up, casting a bluish glow over the room. What followed was a cold, methodical presentation. First came photos, the bread and water, then audio clips, Celeste's words, Rob's laughter, Holland's pre-flight comment. "We should have pulled him before takeoff." Jonah let them play uninterrupted. Next came internal memos, 3 past complaints filed against Celeste, all dismissed without interviews, Holland's prior infractions, the company's own training compliance logs, half complete. No one interrupted, no one tried to explain, because the evidence was overwhelming. When the presentation ended, Jonah looked directly at Bauer. "I came here as a partner, but I was treated as a threat." Bauer swallowed. "We'll terminate the crew immediately." "That's not enough," Jonah said, "because the problem isn't just 3 people. It's the structure that protects them." He turned to the HR executive. "Your department failed to act. That's institutional complicity. I want every unresolved discrimination claim reopened." With external review, the man nodded wordlessly. Jonah continued, "Effective immediately, your airline will adopt the following changes." He tapped again. The screen displayed a list of mandates. Anonymous service audits on every first-class flight. Bias response teams with power to escalate complaints beyond in-flight staff. Public metrics dashboard tracking misconduct, resolution timelines, and accountability. Cultural safety training, not just for flight crew, but for executives and management. FAA-verified reporting channels tied to performance-based funding. "These terms are non-negotiable," Jonah said, "and they'll be announced publicly within 24 hours. Bauer nodded stiffly. "Understood." Jonah leaned forward. "This merger will proceed, but under new leadership and under new expectations." From the corner, Margot cleared her throat. "I've reviewed the footage. I've heard the logs. This story is going out either way. You get to decide how it's framed. Failure or reform." Her voice was steady, but her words cut. Bauer turned to Jonah. "Do we have your statement?" Jonah stood, adjusting his cuffs. "I'll make it myself." Hours later, under morning sunlight, Jonah stood in front of a podium flanked by reporters. Flashbulbs lit the stage. Margot stood nearby, notebook ready. Vanessa scanned the perimeter, her team in formation. Jonah stepped to the mic. Yesterday I boarded Flight 287 as a silent observer. I left as a witness, and now I stand here as a catalyst. He paused, letting the silence hold. What happened to me wasn't rare. It wasn't random. It was a symptom of a deeper condition, one this industry has been allowed to ignore. Behind him, screens displayed the hashtag that had gone viral overnight. $. This meal fits $. This isn't about bread and water. It's about dignity. It's about being seen, being heard, being human. He outlined the reforms, the audits, the transparency measures. He explained that accountability wasn't revenge. It was architecture. And when he finished, the room erupted in applause, not just from journalists, but from staff, from viewers streaming the broadcast across platforms. Later that week, Celeste's name was trending again, not from speculation, but from statements. Former passengers were coming forward. Stories echoed Jonah's. Not identical, but familiar. The airline, facing mounting pressure, agreed to fund an independent equity task force. FAA regulators issued a statement supporting Jonah's new reporting pathways. Other airlines began reviewing their internal protocols. And Jonah, he returned to work, quietly, purposefully. But now, when he traveled, that was different. Not because people feared him, but because systems had changed, and not just for him. The marble-floored lobby of the Skyglass Hotel buzzed with anticipation. Journalists checked their equipment. Industry representatives adjusted their ties. Across a sleek stage framed by floor-to-ceiling windows, the morning sun cast golden streaks across a row of microphones. Jonah Ellison stood just off stage, reviewing the final remarks on his tablet. "Are you sure you want to go unscripted for the second half?" asked Nina, standing at his side. "I'm sure," Jonah replied. He wasn't here to deliver corporate talking points. He was here to set a tone that others would be forced to follow. Vanessa gave him the signal. He stepped forward. Cameras clicked instantly. The low hum of live stream feeds synced across platforms. Every network had sent a crew. But more important than any official outlet were the thousands of phones watching the moment unfold in real time. Jonah looked out at the crowd, then directly into the front row lens. Yesterday I was handed a slice of dry bread and a plastic cup of water in first class. It was delivered with a smile and a message. He paused. "This meal fits you." No one in the room moved. I wasn't dressed the way they expected. I didn't look like someone they were trained to serve with respect. I didn't meet their assumptions, and so they treated me as less. He let that sink in. But the problem isn't just about a flight, or a meal, or a name badge. Jonah scanned the room. The problem is the culture. He began laying out the facts, the history of unresolved complaints, the patterns of denial, the training modules left incomplete. He tied in federal aviation regulations on discrimination, rules that had existed but were rarely enforced without irrefutable evidence. Passengers have rights, but rights without enforcement are just paperwork. Then came the second half of his speech, the unscripted part. Jonah looked beyond the cameras, as if speaking to a broader public. This isn't about retribution. This is about reconstruction. If we want a travel industry that reflects modern values, equity, transparency, dignity, we have to build it. He announced the formation of the Equity in Aviation Task Force, funded jointly by his firm and several advocacy organizations. Its mission would include establishing an anonymous national database of airline discrimination complaints, partnering with regulators to pilot passenger equity scorecards, collaborating with historically excluded communities to shape policy standards. He also revealed a partnership with public schools across 5 major cities, aimed at helping students from underrepresented backgrounds access careers in aviation, tech, and logistics. "We change culture by changing access," he said. The final announcement came as a surprise to many. Jonah introduced Liam Brooks, a 42-year-old former flight attendant and whistleblower who had resigned after speaking out about discrimination in his airline and been blacklisted ever since. Brooks approached the stage to a standing ovation. "Jonah Ellison gave me more than a second chance," he said. "He gave me a platform to help build something better." Brooks would serve as the head of the new Passenger Experience Accountability Division, overseeing real-time auditing of in-flight interactions. But perhaps the most impactful moment came from someone not listed on the official speaker sheet. Toward the end of the press conference, Margot Jensen stepped up. She identified herself not just as a journalist, but as a fellow passenger. "I saw what happened on that flight," she said. "I saw the silence, the complicity. I saw what it cost one man to stay calm while being humiliated." She paused, "But I also saw what accountability can look like. I saw how documentation becomes truth, and how truth, when amplified, becomes change." Her feature, titled "Cabin Pressure," was already scheduled to appear on the cover of the next week's Atlantic Dispatch. In it, she promised not just to recount the facts of Jonah's experience, but to unpack the cultural, psychological, and institutional conditions that made it possible in the first place. Outside the hotel, the streets were filled with reporters, supporters, and activists. Social media had erupted. Hashtags like "This meal fits," "Fly with dignity," and "Change takes flight" were trending across platforms. Celebrities, politicians, and civil rights leaders had weighed in, praising the clarity of Jonah's response and calling on other industries to follow suit. Airline stocks fluctuated, not because of the incident alone, but because of what it signaled: a shift in public expectations. People didn't want hollow apologies anymore. They wanted evidence. They wanted policy. They wanted progress. In the following days, other airlines began updating their internal training protocols. A few even contacted Jonah's team to license parts of his firm's monitoring software. The Department of Transportation issued a statement endorsing proactive accountability tools that align with the new passenger rights framework. And yet Jonah remained focused. When asked during an interview what justice looked like to him, he didn't mention compensation or headlines or being right. "Justice looks like never having to go through it again," he said. "Not for me, not for the next person." As the press conference wrapped, a young woman in a flight attendant's uniform approached Jonah quietly. She worked for a different airline but had followed the story closely. "Thank you," she said. "You're changing the way we think about service, about responsibility." Jonah shook her hand. "It's a start." 6 months later, Jonah Ellison stepped onto another plane. This time, it was a red-eye from Los Angeles to Boston, booked quietly, under no official watch, no mergers, no audits, just a man traveling. As he entered the first-class cabin, he noticed something different, subtle but unmistakable. The crew greeted him not with exaggerated charm, but with professionalism. One offered a menu, another nodded politely and gestured to his seat. The air felt steady. Jonah sat down, accepted the glass of water offered to him, and opened his tablet. A notification blinked on screen. Equity Index Report, Month 6, Audit Results ready. He minimized it for now. Looking out the window, he let his thoughts wander. It wasn't about one slice of bread anymore. That image, the tray, the cup, the look, had been seen by millions. But it had become more than a moment. It had become a mirror, a call to awareness, and eventually, action. In the months that followed the press conference, the changes didn't stop. The Equity in Aviation Task Force grew into a coalition involving regulators, unions, and passenger advocates. Airlines across the country began implementing audit systems. Complaint data, once buried in HR silos, was now reviewed quarterly by external panels. Passengers could submit experiences anonymously, and they did. Some called it a cultural reset. Others called it corporate overcorrection. Jonah called it accountability. He wasn't seeking perfection, just progress. His firm launched a public dashboard called Clear Flight, where passengers could see service equity ratings by airline, updated in real time. Journalists used it. Activists quoted it. Investors paid attention to it. The FAA followed with new pilot programs, expanding enforcement channels for discriminatory behavior. Airlines could now lose federal perks if they failed repeated audits. Change wasn't just coming from within. It was reinforced from above. And Jonah? He stayed mostly out of the spotlight. He focused on infrastructure, on culture, on people. When he did speak, it was deliberate, measured, always pointing forward. That night, somewhere over Ohio, Jonah closed his eyes and rested. He wasn't watching anymore, not this time, because now others were. The camera was off. The eyes were open. The system, once silent, had started to listen. And that, finally, was enough to breathe easy, at least for now.